Zamara's perspective. "Andrew!" I shouted, wandering down an alleyway near where the last reported sighting of the human had been. "I'm not mad at you if that's what you're worried about, not at all. Just come out and we can talk about this. Please?" No response. That, of course, was to be expected. Initially, upon his disappearance, I had assumed rather insultingly that the noise may have frightened the human, causing him to run off. At times, it took a great deal of effort to remind myself that just because a creature is small and cute does not mean it's stupid. Humans, like all the species in our empire, were clearly every bit as sapient as I was. Andrew's running off was no accident, and after investigating the scene of that crash, I was beginning to suspect that it wasn't either. Our safety restrictions regarding driving AI were extensive to such a point that crashes of this magnitude were a near impossibility. For this one in a quintillion event to occur just in time to allow a new species to escape me was much too convenient for my tastes. My hand drifted reflexively to the tranquilizer gun holstered at my hip as I stalked around a corner. The alleyways of Aleph were by no means dangerous, of course. Our AI-monitored camera matrix, keeping watch over all public spaces, made violent crime near impossible to get away with even in secluded areas. For the sake of assuaging civilian concerns regarding their own personal privacy, laws were passed long ago to make camera footage only accessible if law enforcement determined it necessary to preserve the safety of others. Thanks to this diligent surveillance, assault and murder rates throughout the empire were near zero to match those of non-violent crime. Because there was no poverty beneath our benevolent eyes, a vast majority of theft cases were performed by young thrill-seekers, making the use of cameras to track them down a tad bit excessive. I had requested special permission to use these cameras for the purposes of tracking Andrew's movements, but something was apparently interfering with the area's footage. Dread crept through my veins like ice as I navigated further into the labyrinthine alleyways, all the while pondering these two supposed coincidences. There was only one group in the entire empire who could orchestrate such carnage as Hacking Driver AI, and the more I considered this fact, the more obvious it became just who I was dealing with. Continuing my search with an increasing degree of panic swelling up within, I pressed down the speaker button on my earpiece. "Civil!" I half shouted, awaiting a response from the steward secretary, one of the highest offices in the empire available to non-Iragon. Within seconds, the device cracked to life in my ear as on the other side, a Tvesk could be heard typing on an old-fashioned solid-button keyboard. "Yes, Zamara?" he asked, his voice taking on a note of my own concern. The Tvesk were a unique species in that they possessed two fully functional twin brains, only one of which would sleep at a time, allowing for continuous operation. Having a secretary that never slept was certainly helpful, and fortunately for me, Civil was nothing if not dedicated to our cause. "I need you to search the camera network again. Mark any oddities you encounter. I have reason to believe that someone is purposefully tampering with the footage. I want both brains on this assignment, understand?" Yes, Zima," he bleated, his voice faster and more stuttering now with two minds at the helm. When a Tvesk awakens both brains for a task, their MI, measurable intelligence, doesn't simply double, it actually increases threefold. Deciding it best to take a momentary break for the purpose of catching my breath, I leaned against a nearby wall and began panting. I hadn't been lying when I told Andrew that his kind's biological cooling system was impressive. When humanity joined the Empire, their above-average strength and hitherto unheard-of endurance would make them an easy choice for search and rescue workers, perhaps even law enforcement, assuming proper supervision. After that mercifully short period of waiting, my earpiece once again began relaying to me the words of Civil. "There are multiple camera outages near a housing district south of you. I recommend checking it out." "Thank you," I breathed, pausing for a moment to check my communicator for directions before taking off toward the residential area. Exiting the nearby alleyways and unfurling my wings, I took off at top speed over the building and through the streets. Every part of me wanted desperately to believe Andrew's disappearance wasn't the recalcitrant's handiwork. That being said, every part of me also knew that it was them. If the recalcitrants were given the chance to contact humanity, they would surely commit to the same course of action as they usually did, culminating in the extinction of Andrew's species. The residential district was largely an unremarkable place. A few families greeted me as I sprinted past, and while normally I would stop to talk to them, the time-sensitive nature of my objective was simply too much to allow for that at the moment. Moving as quickly as my weary limbs would allow me, I bolted into a nearby alleyway and there resumed my search. It was unlikely for Andrew to be anywhere but the alleyways, as otherwise he might be spotted by passers-by and reported. Turning a corner, I was startled to find my path obstructed by a janitorial robot. Unfortunately, this area is under maintenance. Contact your local municipality for more details. The machine droned, refusing to budge from my path even as I attempted to nudge it aside. "Out of my way!" I demanded, my usual friendly tone faltering for a moment into something altogether angrier as I spoke to the non-sapient machine. "Unfortunately, this area is under maintenance. Contact your local municipality for more details." By this point, my patience had grown razor-thin. Attempting to shove past the machine, however, I was surprised to see it grab my arm as though to stop me. This was as much force as a civilian automaton could legally use against a sapient being. "Unfortunately, this area is under maintenance. Please." The drone's repetitive reproach was quickly cut off, as in a moment of weakness, I drove my fist through its faceplate before tossing aside the newly totaled machine. Making a mental note to find the drone's owner and repay them twice over for their damaged property, I continued my search for the human. I was never one for superstition, but somehow I swear I could feel that I was close. Hopefully, I would be able to talk him out of whatever he was trying to accomplish by running from me. Worst-case scenario, however, I was perfectly willing to tranquilize Andrew if it meant ensuring the safety of his species. When Civil's voice next came through to me, the signal had audibly degraded. "Zim, someone fearing with SIG, cameras, be fool." I could hardly understand what he was saying through all the static. There was no possibility the service her could be so awful unless someone was jamming it on purpose. Minutes later, when next my earpiece's receiver activated, I had been expecting my secretary to inform me that the problem was resolved. "What happened back there, Civil?" I asked. "You shouldn't be here," growled a deep, ominous voice into my ear. It didn't sound like any of my staff nor one of the other council members. "I would advise turning around." "Who are you?" Several long moments slithered past as naught but static resonated through the device. When next I was able to discern a noise from it, that noise was a peal of cold laughter. "A friend of freedom," the voice concluded as I turned yet another corner to find there a hooded figure with a shock baton in his hand. Normally, these devices were used by law enforcement to non-lethally incapacitate dangerous criminals. However, taking a tentative half-step closer, I saw that this weapon had been given one ghastly modification. Someone had removed the current and voltage regulators. Effective as Irrigan's skin was at defending against physical attacks, being made of conductive metal necessarily gave it the major weakness of worsening damage from electricity. The full force of an unregulated shock baton might not be lethal to non-Irrigan, but if its wielder managed to strike me, then, in all likelihood, my ulmas, the symbiotic species that acts as a heart for my species, would stop. "I don't wish to kill you, Zamera, but please do not mistake my lack of desire for a lack of will." The voice continued, its underlying threat more than apparent as the hooded figure before me took a step closer, raising the shock baton in front of them as though to guard against an oncoming attack. "I'm not leaving without Andrew," I stated bluntly. Again, silence. "Then I'm afraid you won't be leaving at all," answered the voice as behind me, an apartment complex door flung open to reveal a second hooded figure wielding the same modified weapon. "Sorry about this, Zimera, but your life is well within the bounds of acceptable casualties." The first of the hooded figures to charge me did so at first with reckless abandon, making a clumsy thrust toward my torso which I effortlessly dodged before shifting my attention to the second, who looked to be waiting by the door for an opening. Aiming my tranquilizer gun toward the initial assailant, I fired the first of its 5 shots in hopes to incapacitate him. Unfortunately, My attempt was in vain, as the recalcitrant quickly ducked beneath my shot and lunged forth before I could adjust my aim. Pretending for the moment to focus my attention entirely on the reckless one, I sidestepped a few of his thrusts as fumblingly as I safely could, creating for the individual behind me an illusion of an opening. Unfortunately, in the process, my weapon was knocked away from me. But when finally I heard the apartment door's complaint, I knew that the second attacker was making their move. Spinning around as quickly as I could, my eyes landed upon the careful one just as my hand did so around their throat, startling them into dropping their weapon. Swinging the struggling recalcitrant around for use as a shield, I watched as the reckless one suddenly seemed for a moment to falter. "I think we're done here," I chimed happily, holding up their struggling comrade with a sneer of manufactured sadism. "I have some important questions, but it doesn't take two to talk. If you run away now, this one gets to keep his life." Naturally, I'd never kill someone who wasn't an active threat, but this other delinquent didn't need to know that for now. Again, the first attacker hesitated, momentarily allowing his grip on the baton to loosen. Before I could capitalize off of this weakness, however, I watched in confusion as the remaining recalcitrant produced from his side a low-caliber pistol, practically a toy when pitted against my Iragon skin. Surely he doesn't actually think he can hit me, let alone cause damage. Apparently, however, I was not his intended target. Instead, I watched in utter bafflement as the rash one unloaded his weapon with heartless abandon into my still struggling shield, rendering them still in my grasp as the shooter charged me with newfound vigor, jamming the high-power shock baton into their former comrade's corpse to indirectly electrocute me. Dropping the dead recalcitrant and staggering away as every part of my body howled in pain and confusion, I desperately glanced about in search of something that might even the playing field. Unfortunately, my tranquilizer gun was far too close to my assailant for me to dive for. The late recalcitrant's shock baton, however, quickly scrambling backward and from the ground beside me, retrieving the shock baton, I raised it in front of me just in time to block a downward swing from my assailant. Following that narrow parry, I shot forth my leg into their kneecap and sent the remaining terrorist buckling to the ground beneath the weight not only of their own body, but of the excruciating pain I hated to cause. Nevertheless, with the fight over and my newest lead writhing on the ground, I quickly retrieved my tranquilizer gun and out of mercy shot the struggling recalcitrant, who by the looks of them was a Nugo male. Finally, with my newest lead in tow, I pressed my earpiece and was delighted to be met with the voice of Civil. "Zemera, are you all right?" "I will be once you order me an evac. I have a captured recalcitrant here, and I get the feeling we might learn a thing or two sifting through his brain." Hopefully, within the next hour or two, I would have the neurosearch data necessary to determine Andrew's objective. Slinging the large amphibian over my shoulder and commencing my journey through the back alleys of Aleph, I sighed to myself in exhaustion. "Don't worry, Andrew, I'll be there to save you, even from yourself if I must."